and many had come to worship Albert Hofmann. And according to Mr. Pollan, he says the event bore many of the hallmarks of a religious observance. Very interesting. And when we talked about how he discovered this as part of the Sandoz laboratory, and he came across this fungus, and he was looking for something else entirely. And he was looking to market a drug from an alkaloids from fungus, and he found this lysergic acid, and he tested the compound, and it didn't show much promise for what he was looking for, so he put it on the shelf. But then one April day in 1943, he had a peculiar presentiment. As he put it, that LSD-25 deserved a second look. Normally, when a compound showing no promise was discarded, it was gone for good, but he liked the chemical structure of the LSD molecule, and something about it told him that this substance could possess properties other than those established in the first investigations. Then another mysterious anomaly occurred when he synthesized LSD-25 for the second time, despite the meticulous precautions he always took when working with a substance as toxic as ergot, which is where this came from. Hofmann must somehow have absorbed a bit of the chemical through his skin, because he was interrupted in my work by unusual sensations. So he went home, he laid down on a couch, and in a dreamlike state with eyes closed perceived an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes, with intense kaleidoscopic play of colors, and thus unfolds the world's first LSD trip, or at least documented, in neutral Switzerland during the darkest days of World War II. It's also the only LSD trip that ever taken that was entirely innocent of expectation. And he was intrigued by this, so he began to do a few more experiments, and ingested 0.25 milligrams of LSD in a glass of water. This would represent a minuscule dose of any other drug, but LSD, it turns out, is one of the most potent psychoactive compounds ever discovered, active at doses measured in micrograms, that is 1,000th of a milligram. This surprising fact would soon inspire scientists to look for and eventually find the brain receptors and the endogenous chemical serotonin that activates them like a key in a lock, as a way to explain how a small number of molecules could have such a profound effect on the mind. And in this and other ways, Hofmann's discovery helped to launch modern brain science in the 1950s. Now unfolds the world's first bad acid trip, as Hofmann plunged into what he is certain is irretrievable madness. He tells his lab assistants he needs to get home. And with the use of automobiles restricted during wartime, he somehow manages to pedal home by bicycle and lie down while his assistants summons the doctor. Hofmann describes how familiar objects and pieces of furniture assumed grotesque, threatening forms. They were in continuous motion, animated as if driven by an inner restlessness. He experienced the disintegration of the outer world and the dissolution of his own ego. A demon had invaded me, had taken possession of my body, mind, and soul. I jumped up and screamed, trying to free myself from it, but then it sank down again and lay helpless on the sofa. Hofmann became convinced he was going to be rendered permanently insane, or might actually be dying. My ego was suspended somewhere in space, and I saw my body lying dead on the sofa. When the doctor arrived and examined him, however, he found that all of Hofmann's vital signs were perfectly normal. The only indication something was amiss were his pupils, which were dilated in the extreme. Once the acute effects wore off, Hofmann felt the afterglow that frequently follows a psychedelic experience, the exact opposite of a hangover. When he walked onto his garden after a spring rain, everything glistened and sparkled in a fresh light. The world was as if newly created. We've since learned that the experience of psychedelics is powerfully influenced by one's expectation. No other class of drugs are more suggestible in their effects. Because Hoffman's experiences with LSD are the only ones we have that are uncontaminated by previous accounts, it's interesting to note they exhibit neither the Eastern nor Christian flavorings that would soon become conventions in the genre. However, his experience of familiar objects coming to life in the world as if newly created, the same rapturous Adamic moment that Aldous Huxley would describe so vividly a decade later in The Doors of Perception, would become commonplace of the psychedelic experience. Hoffman came back from his trip convinced, first, that LSD had somehow found him rather than the other way around, and second, that LSD would someday be of great value to medicine, and especially psychiatry, possibly by offering researchers a model of schizophrenia. Well, that's an interesting idea. It never occurred to him that his problem child, as he eventually would regard LSD, would also become a pleasure drug and a drug of abuse. And that was the beginning of this, the discovery and the use of LSD for research purposes. And it's fascinating to see, this is the guy that first took the trip. Very fascinating to see. So the exploration of consciousness is really the great new frontier. Forget about space, or Space Force is being bandied about these days. This is really the new frontier. And it's hardly new. That's the problem. It's hardly new. We've touched on it, we've flirted with it, but as I've said, if you just do a search, you'll see how much traditional science has just ignored this. And you wonder why. And I have a theory about why. But I'll have to wait till next week, because we are running short of time. But I will leave you with this. Traditional science presumes consciousness to emerge from complex neuronal computation and to have arisen during biological evolution as an adaptation of living systems, extrinsic to the makeup of the universe. On the other hand, spiritual and contemplative traditions, and some scientists and philosophers, consider consciousness to be intrinsic, woven into the fabric of the universe. In these views, conscious precursors and Platonic forms preceded biology, existing all along in the fine-scale structure of reality. In other words, consciousness creates reality, which is what quantum physics is coming to quite rapidly. All right. So, next week we will talk more about consciousness, use of psychedelics, healing and all that, and the fascinating world of research that it entails. Till then,